Queen Knave, Vladimir Nabokov, translated by Dmitry Nabokov in collaboration with the author. To Vera. Forward. Of all my novels, this bright brute is the gayest. Expatriation, destitution, nostalgia had no effect on its elaborate and rapturous composition. Conceived on the coastal sands of Pomerania Bay in the summer of 1927, constructed in the course of the following winter in Berlin, and completed in the summer of 1928, was published there in early October by the Russian émigré house Slovo under the title Korol Dama Valet. It was my second Russian novel. I was 28. I had been living in Berlin on and off for half a dozen years. I was absolutely sure with a number of other intelligent people at some time in the next decade we would all be back in a hospitable, remorseful, racemosa blossoming Russia. In the autumn of the same year, Holstein acquired the German rights. The translation was made completely, as I was assured, by Siegfried von Vegesack, whom I recall meeting in the beginning of 1929 when passing with my wife post-haste through Paris to spend Holstein's generous advance on a butterfly safari in the Oriental Pyrenees. Our interview took place in this hotel, where he lay in bed with a bad cold, wretched but monocled, while famous American authors were having quite a time in bars and so forth, as it is often said, their wont. One might readily conjecture that a Russian writer, in choosing a set of exclusively German characters, the appearances of my wife and me in the last two chapters are merely visits of inspection, was creating for himself insurmountable difficulties. I spoke no German, had no German friends, had not read a single German novel either in the original or in translation, but in art as in nature, a glaring disadvantage may turn out to be a subtle provocative device. The human humidity, Cheloveshkia Vlajnost, permeating my first novel, Mashinka, published in 1926 by Slovo, and also brought out in German by Holstein, was also very well, but the book no longer pleased me as it pleases me now for new reasons. The émigré characters I had collected in that display box were so transparent to the eye of the era that one could easily make out the labels behind them. What the labels said was fortunately not too clear, but I felt no inclination to persevere in a technique assignable to the French human document type. With a hermetic community faithfully described by one of its members, something not unsimilar in a small way to the impassioned and boring ethnophysics which depress one so often in modern novels, at a stage of gradual inner disentanglement which I had not yet found or not yet dare apply, the very special methods of recreating a historical situation that I used 10 years later in The Gift, the lack of any emotional involvement, and the fairy tale freedom inherent in any unknown milieu, answer my dream of pure invention. I might have staged KQK in Romania or Holland. Familiarity with the map and weather of Berlin settled my choice. But the end of 1966, my son had prepared a literal translation of the book in English that I placed on my lectern beside a copy of the Russian edition. I foresaw having to make a number of revisions affecting the actual text of a 40-year-old novel, which I had not yet reread ever since its proofs had been corrected by an author twice younger than the reviser. Very soon I asserted that the original sagged considerably more than I expected. I do not wish to spoil the pleasure of future collators by discussing the little changes I made. Let me only remark that my main purpose in making them was not to beautify a corpse, but to rather to permit a still-breathing body to enjoy certain innate capacities, which inexperience and eagerness, the haste of thought and the sloth of word, had denied it formerly. Within the texture of the creature, those possibilities were practically crying to be developed or teased out. I accomplished the operation not without relish. The coarseness and lewdness of the book, that alarmed my kindest critiques and émigré periodicals, have of course been preserved, but I confess to have mercilessly struck out and rewritten many lame odds and ends, such as, for instance, a crucial translation in my last chapter, where, in order to get rid temporarily of Franz, who was not supposed to butt in while certain important scenes in the Gravitz resort engaged the attention of the author, the latter used the despicable expedient of having Dreyer send Franz away to Berlin with a scallop-shaped cigarette case that had to be returned to a businessman who had mislaid it with the author's connivance. A similar object also figures, I see, in Speak Memory, 1966, and quite properly, too, for its shape is that of the famous In Search of Lost Time cake. I cannot say I feel I have been losing time over a dated novel. Its revised text may soften and entertain even such readers as are opposed, for religious reasons no doubt, to an author's thriftily and imperturbably resurrecting all his old works, one after the other, while working on a new novel that has now obsessed him for 5 years. But I do not think that even a godless author owes too much to his juvenilia not to take advantage of a situation hardly ever twinned in the history of Russian literature, save for the administrative oblivion the books banned with a shudder in a sad and remote country. I have not said anything yet about the plot of King, Queen, Knave. The plot is basically not unfamiliar. In fact, I suspect that those two worthies, Balzac and Dreiser, will accuse me of gross parody, but I swear I had not read their preposterous stuff at the time. I even now do not quite know what they are talking about under their cypresses. After all, Charlotte Humbert's husband was not quite innocent either. Speaking of literary currents, I must admit I was a little surprised to find in my Russian text so many monologue interior passages no relation to Ulysses, which I hardly knew at the time, and of course I had been exposed since tender boyhood to Anna Karenine, which contains a whole scene consisting of those intonations Eden knew 100 years ago, now well used. On the other hand, my amiable little imitations of Madame Bovary, which good readers will not fail to distinguish, represent a deliberate tribute to Flaubert. I remember remembering, in the course of one scene, Emma creeping at dawn to her lover's chateau along impossibly unobservant black lanes, for even Homais nods. As usual, I wish to observe that, as usual, several sensitive people I will look huffy. The Viennese delegation has not been invited. If, however, a resolute Freudian manages to slip in, he or she should be warned that a number of cruel traps have been set here and there in the novel. Finally, the question of the title. Those 3 court cards, all hearts, I have retained, while discarding a small pair. The 2 new cards dealt me may justify the gamble, for I've always had an ivory thumb in this game. Tightly, narrowly, closely, through the smart of tobacco smoke, one edge is squeezed out, frog's heart, as they say in Russian Gulch, and jingle bells. I can only hope that my good old partners, replete with full horses and straights, will think I am bluffing. Vladimir Nabokov, March 28, 1967, Montreux. King, Queen, Knave. 1. The huge black clock hand is still at rest, but is on the point of making its once-a-minute gesture. That resilient jolt will set a whole world in motion. The clock face will slowly turn away, full of despair, contempt, and boredom, as one by one the iron pillars will start walking past, bearing away the vault of the station like bland Atlantis. The form will begin to move past, carrying off on an unknown journey cigarette butts, used tickets, flecks of sunlight and spittle. A luggage handcart will glide by, its wheel motionless. It will be followed by a news stall, hung with seductive magazines covers, photographs of naked pearl-gray beauties, and people on the moving platform, themselves moving their feet, yet standing still, striding forward, yet retreating, as in an agonizing dream full of incredible effort. Nausea, a cottony weakness in one's calves, will surge back, almost falling supine. There were more women than men, as is always the case at partings. Franz's sister, with the pallor of the early hour on her thin cheeks, and an unpleasant empty stomach smell, dressed in a checked cape that surely one would never see on a city girl, and his mother, small, round, all in brown, like a compact little monk. See the handkerchiefs beginning to flutter. And not only did they slip away, those 2 familiar smiles, not only did the station depart, removing its newsstand, its luggage cart, and a sandwich and fruit vendor with such nice, plump, lumpy, gloss-red strawberries, positively crying to be bitten into, all their achings proclaiming their affinity with one's own tongue's papillae. But alas, gone now. Not only did this fall behind, the entire old burg in its rosy autumn morning mist moved as well. The great stone herzog in the square, the dark cathedral, the shop signs, top hat, a fish, the copper basin of a barber. There is no shopping world now. In grand style, houses pass by, the curtains flap in the open windows of his home. Its floors crackle a little, the walls creak. His mother and sister are drinking their morning coffee in the swift draught. The furniture shudders from the quickening jolts, and ever more rapidly, more mysteriously, travel the houses, the cathedral, the square, the side streets, and even though by now tilled fields had been long Unfolding their patchwork past the railway car window, Franz still felt, in his very bones, the receding motion of the townlet where he had lived for 20 years. Besides Franz, the wood-benched third-class compartment contained two old ladies in corduroy dresses, a plump, inevitably red-checked woman with the inevitable basket of eggs in her lap, and a blond youth in tan shorts, sturdy and angular, very much like his own rucksack, which was tightly stuffed and looked as if it had been hewed off a yellow stone. This he had energetically shaken off and heaved onto a shelf. This seat by the door opposite Franz was occupied by a magazine in which the picture of a breathtaking girl, and at a window by the corridor, his back to the compartment, stood a broad-shouldered man in a black overcoat. The train was now going fast. Franz suddenly clutched his side, transfixed by the thought that he had lost his wallet, which contained so much, the solid little ticket, and a stranger's visiting card with precious address, and an inviolate month of human life in Reichsmarks. The wallet was there, all right, firm and warm. The old ladies began to stir and whistle, unwrapping sandwiches. The man in the corridor turned, and with a slight lurch, retreating half a step, and then overcoming the sway of the floor, entered the compartment. Most of the nose had gone or had never grown. To what remained of its bridge, the pale parchment-like skin adhered with a sickening tightness. The nostrils had lost all sense of decency and faced the flinching spectator like two sudden holes. Black and asymmetrical, the cheeks and forehead showed a geographical range of shades, yellowish, pinkish, and very glossy. Had he inherited that mask? And if not, what illness, what explosion, what acid had disfigured him? He had practically no lips. The absence of eyelashes lent his blue eyes a startled expression, and yet the man was smartly dressed, well-groomed, and well-built. He wore a double-breasted suit under his heavy overcoat. His hair was as sleek as a wig. He pulled up the knees of his trousers, and he sat down with a leisurely movement, and his gray-gloved hands opened the magazine he had left on the seat. The shudder that passed between Franz's shoulder blades now tapered to a strange sensation in his mouth. His tongue felt repulsively alive, his palate nastily moist. His memory opened its gallery of waxworks, and he knew that there, at its far end somewhere, a chamber of horrors awaited him. He remembered a dog that had vomited on the threshold of a butcher's shop. He remembered a child, a mere toddler, who, bending with the difficulty of its age, had laboriously picked up and put to its lips a filthy thing resembling a baby's pacifier. He remembered an old man with a cough in a streetcar who had fired a clot of mucus into the ticket collector's hand. These were the images that Franz usually held at bay, but that had always kept swarming in the background of his life, greeting with a hysterical spasm any new impression that was given to them. After a shock of that sort, that those still recent days, he would throw himself prone on his bed and try to fight off in the fit of nausea. His recollections of school seemed always to be dodging away from impossible contacts with the grubby, pimply, slippery skin of some companion or other, pressing him to join a game or eager to impart some spitter's secret. The man was leafing through the magazine, and the combination of his face with its enticing cover was intolerably grotesque. The ruddy egg woman sat next to the monster, her sleepy shoulder touching him. The youth's rucksack rubbed against his slick, sticker-mottled black phallus. And worst of all, the old ladies, ignoring their foul neighbor, munched their sandwiches and sucked on fuzzy sections of orange, wrapping the peels in scraps of paper and popping them daintily under the seat. But when the man put down his magazine and, without taking off his gloves, himself began eating a bun with cheese, glancing around provokingly, Franz could stand it no longer. He rose quickly. He lifted like a martyr. His pale face shook loose and pulled down his humble suitcase, collected his raincoat, and, banging his suitcase awkwardly against the door jamb, fled into the corridor. This particular coach had been hooked onto the express at a recent station, and the air was still fresh. He immediately felt a sense of release, but the dizziness had not quite passed. A wall of beech trees was flickering by the window in a speckled sequence of sun and shade. He began tentatively to walk along the corridor, clutching at knobs and things, and peering into the compartments. Only one had a free seat. He hesitated and went on, shaking off the image of two pasty-faced children with dust-black hands, their shoulders hunched up in expectation of a blow from their mother right on the nape, as they quietly kept sliding off the seat to play among greasy scraps of papers on the unmentionable floor at the passenger's feet. Franz reached the end of the car and paused, struck by an extraordinary thought. This thought was so sweet, so audacious and exciting that he had to take off his glasses and wipe them. "No, I can't. Out of the question," said Franz under his breath, already realizing, however, that he could not conquer the temptation. Yet checking the knot of his tie with thumb and forefinger, he crossed in a burst of clangor the unsteady connecting plates, and with an exquisite sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach passed into the next car. It was a second-class Schnelzug car, and to Franz, second class was something brightly attractive, even slightly sinful, smacking of spicy extravagance like a sip of thick white liqueur, or that enormous grapefruit resembling a yellow skull that he had once brought on the way to school. About first class one could not dream at all. That was for diplomats, generals, and almost unearthly actresses. Second, if only he could get up the courage. They said his late father, a seedy notary, had on occasion long ago before the war traveled second class. Yet Franz could not make up his mind. He stopped at the beginning of the corridor, by the placard listing the car inventory, and now it was no longer a fence-like forest glancing by, but vast meadows majestically gliding past, and in the distance, parallel to the tracks, flowed a highway, along which sped lickety-split a Lilliputian automobile. The conductor, just then making his rounds, brought him out of his difficulty. Franz bought a supplement promoting his ticket to the next rank. A short tunnel deafened him with its resounding darkness. Then it was light again, but the conductor had vanished. The compartment that Franz entered with a silent, unacknowledged bow was accompanied by only two people, a handsome, bright-eyed lady and a middle-aged man with a clipped, tawny mustache. Franz hung up his raincoat and sat down carefully. The seat was so soft, there was such a cozy semicircular projection at temple level separating one seat from the next. The photographs on the wall were so romantic, a flock of sheep, a cross on a rock, a waterfall. He slowly stretched out his long legs, slowly took a folded newspaper from his pocket, but he was unable to read. Benumbed with luxury, he merely held the newspaper open and from behind it examined his fellow travelers. Oh, they were charming. The lady wore a black suit and diminutive black hat with a little diamond swallow. Her face was serious, her eyes cold, a little dark down. The sign of passion glistened above her upper lip, and a gleam of sun brought out the creamy texture of her neck at the throat with its two delicate transverse lines, as if traced with a fingernail across it, one above the other, also a token of all kinds of marbles, according to one of his schoolmates, a precocious expert. The man must be a foreigner, judging by his soft collar and tweeds. Franz, however, was mistaken. "I'm thirsty," said the man with a Berlin accent. "Too bad there's no fruit. Those strawberries were positively dying to be sampled." "It's your own fault," answered the lady in a displeased voice, adding a little while later, "I still cannot get over it. It was such a silly thing to do." Dreyer briefly cast up his eyes to a makeshift heaven and made no reply. "It's your own fault," she repeated, and automatically pulled at her pleated skirt, automatically noticing that the awkward young man in the glasses, who appeared in the door corner, seemed to be fascinated by the sheer silk of her legs. "Anyway," she said, "it's not worth discussing." Dreyer knew that his silence irritated Martha unspeakably. There was a boyish gleam in his eyes, and the soft folds about his lips were undulating because he was rolling a mint in his mouth. The incident that irritated his wife was actually pretty silly. They had spent August and half of September in Tyrol, and now on the way home had stopped for a few days on business in that quaint little town, and there he had called on his cousin Lena, with whom he had danced in his youth, some 25 years ago. His wife had flatly refused to accompany him. Lena, now a roly-poly creature with false teeth, but just as talkative and amiable as ever, found that the years had left their mark on him, but that it might have been worse. She served him excellent coffee, told him about her children, said she was very sorry they were not at home, asked about Martha, whom she did not know, and his business, about which she was well informed. Then, after a pious pause, she wondered if he could give her a piece of advice. It was warm in the room where, around the aged chandelier, the gray little glass pendants like dirty icicles, flies were describing parallelograms, lighting every time on the same pendants, which for some reason amused him, and the old chairs extended their plush-covered arms with comical cordiality. An old pug dozed on an embroidered cushion. In reply to the expectant interrogatory sigh of his cousin, he had suddenly said, coming to life with a laugh, "Well, why don't you have him come to see me in Berlin? I'll give him a job." And that was what his wife could not forgive him. She called it swamping the business with poor relations. But when you come down to it, how can one poor relation swamp anything, knowing that Lena would invite his wife, and that Martha would not go in any circumstance? He had lied, telling his cousin that they were leaving that same evening. Instead, Martha and he had visited a fair and splendid vineyards of a business friend. A week later, at the station, when they had already settled down in their compartment, he had glimpsed Lena from the window. It was a wonder they had not run into her somewhere in the town. Martha wanted to avoid her seeing them at all costs, and even though the idea of buying a nest of fruit for the trip appealed to him greatly, he did not put his head out of the window, did not beckon with a soft psst. The young vendor in the white jacket, comfortably dressed, in perfect health, a colored mist of vague, pleasant thoughts in his head and a peppermint in his mouth. Dreyer sat with crossed arms, and the soft folds of fabric in the crook of his arms matched the soft folds of his cheeks, and the outline of his clipped mustache, and the wrinkles fanning templeward from his eyes. With a peculiar, brandly amused gleam in his eye, he gazed from under his brows at the green landscape gliding in the window, at Martha's handsome profile rimmed with sunlight, and the cheap suitcase of the bespectacled young man who was reading a newspaper in the corner by the door. Idly he considered that passenger palpating from all sides. He noted the so-called lizard pattern of the young fellow's green and garnet tie, which obviously had cost 95 pfennigs, the stiff collar, and also the cuffs in the front of his shirt, a shirt, incidentally, which only existed in an abstract form, since all its visible parts, judging by a treacherous gloss, were pieces of a starched armor of rather low quality, but greatly esteemed by a frugal provincial who attaches them to an invisible undergarment made of unbleached cloth. As to the young man's suit, it evoked a delicate melancholy in Dreyer as he reflected not for the first time on the pathetically short life of every new cut. That kind of three-button, narrow-lapelled blue jacket with a pinstripe had disappeared from most Berlin stores at least 5 years ago. 2 alarmed eyes were suddenly born in the lenses, and Dreyer turned away. Martha said, "It is all so silly. I wish you had listened to me." Her husband sighed and said nothing. She wanted to go on. There were still lots of pithy rebukes she could make, but she felt the young man was listening, and instead of words, leaned her elbow abruptly on the window side of the table leaf, pulling up the skin of her cheek with her knuckles. She sat that way until the flicker of woods in the window became irksome. She slowly straightened her right body, annoyed and bored, and leaned back and closed her eyes. The sun penetrated her eyelids with solid scarlet, across which luminous stripes moved in succession, the ghostly negative of the passing forest and the replica of her husband's cheerful face, as if slowly rotating toward her, got mixed up in this barred redness, and she opened her eyes with a start. Her husband, however, was sitting relatively far, reading a book bound in purple morocco. He was reading attentively and with pleasure. Nothing existed beyond the sunlit page. He turned the page, looked around in the outside world avidly. Like a playful dog, waiting for that moment, darted up to him with a bright bound. But pushing Tom away affectionately, Dreyer again immersed himself in his anthology of verse. For Martha, that frolicsome radiance was simply the stuffy air of a swaying railway car. It is supposed to be stuffy in a car. That is customary and therefore good. Life should proceed according to plan, straight and strict, without freakish twists and wiggles. An elegant book is all right on a drawing-room table. In a railway car, to allay boredom, one can leaf through some trashy magazine, but to imbibe and relish poems, if you please, in an expensive binding, a person who calls himself a businessman cannot, must not, dare not act like that. But for that matter, perhaps he may be doing it on purpose to spite me. Just another of his show-off whims. Very well, my friend, keep showing off. How nice it would be to pluck that book out of his hands and lock it up in a suitcase. At that instant the sun seemed to lay bare her face, flowing over her smooth cheeks and lending an artificial warmth to her eyes with their large, elastic-looking pupils, amid the dove-gray iris and adorable dark lids slightly creased like violets, radiantly lashed and rarely blinking, as if she were constantly afraid of losing sight of an essential goal. She wore almost no makeup. Only in the minute transverse fissures of her full lips there seemed to be drawing traces of orange-red paint. Franz, who had been hiding behind his newspaper in a state of blissful non-existence, living in the outside of himself, and the chance motions and chance words of his traveling companions, now started to assert himself and openly, almost arrogantly, looked at the lady. Yet only a moment ago his thoughts, always tending to morbid associations, had blended in one of those falsely harmonious images that are significant within the dream but meaningless when one recalls it, to recent events. The transition from the third-class compartment, where a noseless monster reigned in silence, into this sunny plush room appeared to him like the passage from a hideous hall through the purgatory of the corridors and intervestibular clatter into a little abode of bliss. The old conductor who had punched his ticket a short while ago and promptly vanished might have been as humble and omnipotent as St. Peter. Pious popular prince that had frightened him in childhood came to life again. He transformed the conductor's click into that of a key unlocking the gates of a paradise. So a grease-painted, gaudy-faced actor in a miracle play passes along a long stage, divided into 3 parts, from the jaws of the devil into the shelter of angels, and Franz, in order to drive away the old obsessive fantasy, eagerly started to seek human, everyday tokens that would break the spell. Martha helped him. While looking sideways out of the window, she yawned. He glimpsed the swell of her tense tongue in the red penumbra of her mouth and the flash of her teeth before her hand shot up to her mouth to stop her soul from escaping, whereupon she blinked, dispersing a trickling tear with the beat of her eyelids. Franz was not one to resist the example of a yawn, especially one that resembled somehow those luscious, lascivious autumn strawberries for which his hometown was famous. At the moment when, unable to overcome the force preying his palate, He convulsively opened his mouth. Martha happened to glance at him, and he realized, snarling and weeping, that she realized he had been looking at her. The morbid bliss he had shortly before experienced as he looked at her dissolving face now turned to acute embarrassment. He knit his brows under her radiant and indifferent gaze, and when she turned away, mentally calculated, as though his fingers had rattled across the counters of a secret abacus, how many days of his life he would give to possess this woman. The door slid open, and an excited waiter, the herald of some frightful disaster, thrust his head in, barked his message, and dashed on to the next compartment to cry his news. Basically, Martha was opposed to those fraudulent, frivolous meals, with the railway company charging you exorbitant prices for mediocre food, and this almost physical sensation of needless expense, mixed with the feeling that someone snug and robust wanted to cheat her, proved to be so strong that were it not for a ravenous hunger, she would certainly not have gone that long vacillating way into the dining car. She vaguely envied the bespectacled young man who reached into the pocket of his raincoat hanging beside him and pulled out a sandwich. She got up and took her handbag in her arm. Dwyer found the violet ribbon in his book, marked his page with it, and after waiting a couple of seconds as if he could not immediately make the transition from one world to the other, gave his knees a light slap and stood up too. He instantly filled the whole compartment, being one of those men who, despite medium height and moderate corpulence, creates an impression of extraordinary bulk. Franz retracted his feet. Martha and her husband lurched past him and went out. He was left alone with his gray sandwich. In the now spacious compartment, he munched and gazed out of the window. A green bank was rising there diagonally until it suffused the window to the top, then resolving an iron cord. A bridge banged overhead, and instantly the green slope vanished and an open country unfurled. Fields, willows, a golden birch tree, a winding brook, beds of cabbage. Franz finished his sandwich, fidgeted cozily, and closed his eyes. Berlin! In that very name of the still unfamiliar metropolis, in the lumber and rumble of his first syllable, and in the light ring of the second, there was something that excited him, like the romantic names of good wines and bad women. The express seemed already to be speeding along the famous avenue lined for him with gigantic ancient lindens, beneath which seethed for him a flamboyant crowd. The express sped past those lindens, grown so luxuriantly out of the avenue's resonant name, and Derlin, Derlin, went the bell of the waiter summoning belated dinners, shot under an enormous arch ornamented with the mother-of-pearl spangles. Farther on, there was an enchanting mist where another picture postcard turned on its stand, showing a translucent tower against a black background. It vanished, and in a brilliantly lit-up emporium, among gilded dummies, limpid mirrors, and glass counters, Franz strolled about in a cut-away striped trousers and white spats, with a smooth movement of his hands, directed customers to the departments they needed. This was no longer a wholly conscious play of thought, nor was it yet a dream, and at that instant that sleep was about to trip him up. Franz regained control of himself and directed his thoughts according to his wishes. He promised himself a lone treat that very night. He bared the shoulders of the woman who had just been sitting by the window, made a quick mental test. Did blind Eros react? Clumsy Eros did, unsticking its folds in the dark, then keeping the splendid shoulders, changed his head, substituting it for the face of that 17-year-old maid who had vanished with a silver soup ladle almost as big as she had before she had time to declare his love. But that head, too, he erased, and in its place attached the face of one of those bold-eyed, humid-lipped Berlin beauties that one encounters mainly in liquor and cigarette advertisements. Only then did the image come to life. The bare-bosomed girl lifted a wine-glass to her crimson lips, gently swinging her apricot silk leg, as a red blackless slipper slowly slid off her foot. The slipper fell off, and Franz, bending down after it, plunged softly into dark slumber. He slept with mouth agape, so that his pale face presented 3 apertures, 2 shiny ones, his glasses, 1 black, his mouth. Dwyer noticed this symmetry when an hour later he returned with Martha from the dining car. In silence they stepped over a lifeless leg. Martha put her handbag on the collapsible window table, and the bag's nickel clasp with its cat eye immediately came to life as a green reflection began dancing on it. Dwyer took out a cigar, but did not light it. The dinner, particularly that Wiener Schnitzel, had turned out to be pretty good, and Martha was not sorry now that she had agreed to go. Her complexion had grown warmer. Her exquisite eyes were moist, her freshly painted lips glistened. She smiled, only just baring her incisors, and this contented, precious smile lingered on her face for several instants. Dwyer lazily admired her, his eyes slightly narrowed, savoring her smile as one might an unexpected gift, but nothing on earth could have made him show that pleasure. When the smile disappeared, he turned away as satisfied gawker drifts away after the bicyclist has picked himself up and the street vendor has replaced on his cart the scattered fruit. Franz crossed his legs like one very lame and slow, but did not wake up. Harshly the train began barking. There glided past a brick wall an enormous chimney, freight cars standing on a siding. Presently it grew dark in the compartments. They entered a vast domed station. "I'll go out, my love," said Dreyer, who liked to smoke in the open air. Left alone, Martha leaned back in the corner, and having nothing better to do, looked at the bespectacled corpse in the corner, thinking indifferently that this, perhaps, was the young man's stop, and he would miss it. Dreyer strode along the platform, drummed with 5 fingers on the window-pane as he passed, but his wife did not smile again. With a puff of smoke, he moved on. He strolled leisurely, with a bouncing gait, his hands clasped behind his back, and his cigar thrust forward. He reflected that it would be nice some day to be promenading like this beneath the glazed arches of a remote station somewhere on the way to Andalusia, Baghdad, or Nizhny Novgorod. Actually, one could set off at any time. The globe was enormous and round, and he had enough spare cash to circle it completely 6 times. Martha, though, would refuse to come, preferring a trim suburban lawn to the most luxuriant jungle. She would only sniff sarcastically were he to suggest that they take a year off. "I suppose," he thought, "I ought to buy a paper. I guess the stock market is also an interesting and tricky subject, and let us see if our 2 aviators, or is it some wonderful hoax, have managed to duplicate in reverse direction that young American's feat of 4 months ago. America, Mexico, Palm Beach. Willie Wald was there, wanted us to accompany him. No, there is no breaking her down. Now then, where is the newsstand? That old sewing machine with its arthritic pedal wrapped up in brown paper is so clear right now, and yet in an hour or 2 I shall forget it forever. I shall forget that I looked at it. I shall forget everything." Just when a whistle blew and the baggage car moved. "Hey, that's my train!" Dreyer made for the newsstand at a smart trot, selected a coin from his palm, snatched the paper he wanted, dropped it, retrieved it, and dashed back. Not very gracefully, he hopped onto a passing step and could not open the door immediately. In the struggle he lost his cigar but not his paper. Chuckling and panting, he walked through one car, another, a third. In the next to last corridor, a big fellow in a black overcoat who was pulling windows shut moved to let it by. Glancing at him as he passed, Dreyer saw the grinning face of a grown man with the nose of a baby monkey. Curious, thought Dreyer. Ought to get such a dummy to display something funny. In the next car he found his compartment, stepped across the lifeless leg, by now a familiar fixture, and quietly sat down. Martha was apparently asleep. He opened the paper and then noticed that her eyes were fixed upon him. "Crazy idiot," she said calmly, and closed her eyes again. Dreyer nodded amiably and immersed himself in his paper. The first chapter of a journey is always detailed in snow. Its middle hours are drowsy and the last one swift. Presently Franz awoke and made some chewing motions with his lips. His traveling companions were sleeping. The light in the window had dimmed, but in compensation the reflection of Martha's little bright swallow had appeared in it. Franz glanced at his wrist, and the watch face, sturdily protected by its metal mesh, a lot of the time, however, had escaped from that prison cell. There was a most repulsive taste in his mouth. He carefully wiped with a special square of cloth his glasses and made his way out into the corridor in search of the toilet. As he stood there, holding on to an iron handle, he found it strange and dreadful to be connected to a cold hole where his stream glistened and bounced, with the dark, headlong, rushing naked earth so near, so fateful. An hour later, the Dryers also woke up. A waiter brought them café au lait and bulky cups, and Martha criticized each sip she took. Dusk deepened in the faded fields, which seemed to run faster and faster. Then rain began to patter softly against the window. A rillet would snake down the glass, stop hesitantly, and then again resume its quick downward zigzag course. Outside the corridor's windows, a narrow orange sunset smoldered beneath a black thunderhead. Presently the light went on in the compartment. Martha looked at length in a little mirror, baring her teeth and raising her upper lip. Dreyer, still replete with her pleasant warmth of slumber, looked at the dark blue window at the raindrops and thought that tomorrow was Sunday, and that in the morning he would go to play tennis, which had recently taken up with the desperate zeal of middle age, and that it would be a shame if the weather interfered with his plans. He asked himself if he had made any progress. Unconsciously tensing his right shoulder, he remembered the beautifully groomed, sun-swept court in his favorite Tyrol resort, and the fabled player who had arrived for a local match in a white flannel overcoat with an English club muffler around his neck and 3 rackets under his arm, and then unhurriedly with professional gestures had taken off that coat and the long striped scarf and the white sweater under the coat, and then with a flash of his arm bared to the elbow had ringingly offered poor Paul von Lepel the indolent and terrible present of the first practice ball. Autumn. Rain," said Martha, slamming her handbag shut. "Oh, just drizzle," Dryer corrected her softly. The train, as if it were already within the magnetic field of the metropolis, was now traveling with incredible speed. The window panes had grown completely dark. One could not even distinguish the sky. The fiery stripe of an express flashed by in the opposite direction, and it was cut off with being forever. It had been a hoax after all. That flight to America. Franz, who had returned to the compartment, suddenly clutched convulsively at his side. Another hour passed, and in the murky gloom there appeared distant clusters of light, diamond-like conflagrations. Soon Dryer stood up. Franz, with a chill of excitement on his frame, stood up too. The ritual of arrival had begun. Dryer pulled down his bags. He enjoyed handing them to partners through the window. Franz, standing on tiptoe, pulled at his suitcase too. Their backs collided elastically, and Dryer laughed. Franz started pulling on his raincoat, failed to find the armhole at the first poke, donned his bottle-green hat, and went on the corridor with his reluctant suitcase. More lights speckled the darkness now, and suddenly a street with illuminated tram was revealed seemingly under his very feet. It disappeared again behind house walls that were being rapidly shuffled and dealt out again. "Come on, hurry," implored Franz. A minor station flew past, just a platform, a half-open jewel box, and all grew dark again, as if no Berlin existed within miles. At last a topaz light spread out over 1,000 tracks and rows of wet railway cars. Slowly, surely, smoothly, the huge iron cavity of the station drew in the train, which at once grew sluggish and then with a jolt redundant. Franz descended into the smoky depth. As he passed by the car he had lived in, he saw his tawny-mustached traveling companion blowing a window and hailing a porter. For a moment he regretted to have parted forever with that adorable, capricious, slow-eyed lady. Together with a hurrying crowd, he walked down the tremendously long platform, surrendered his ticket to its taker with an impatient hand, and continued past innumerable posters, counters, flower shops, people burdened with unnecessary bags to an archway and freedom. Two, golden haze, puffy bedquilt. Another awakening, but perhaps not yet the final one. This occurs not infrequently. You come to see yourself, say, sitting in an elegant second-class compartment with a couple of elegant strangers. Actually, though, this is a false awakening, being merely the next layer of your dream, as if you were rising up from stratum to stratum, but never reaching the surface, never emerging into reality. Your spellbound thought, however, mistakes every new layer of the dream for the door of reality. You believe in it. Holding your breath, leave the railway station you have been brought to in immemorial fantasies, and cross the station square. You discern next to nothing, for the night is blurred by the rain. Your spectacles are foggy, and you want as quickly as possible to reach the ghostly hotel across the square, so as you wash your face, change your shirt cuffs, and then go wandering along the dazzling streets. Something happens, however, an absurd mishap, and what seemed reality abruptly loses the tingle and tang of reality. Your consciousness was deceived. You are still fast asleep. Incoherent slumber dulls your mind. Then comes a new moment of specious awareness. This golden haze in your room in the hotel, whose name is the Montevideo. A shopkeeper you knew at home, a nostalgic Berliner, had jotted it down on a slip of paper for you. Yet who knows? Is this reality, the final reality, or just a new deceptive dream? Lying on his back, Franz peered with myopic, agonizingly narrowed eyes at the blue mist of a ceiling, and then sideways at his radiant blur, which no doubt was a window, and in order to free himself from this gold-tinted vagueness, still so strongly reminiscent of a dream, he reached toward the night table and groped for his glasses. And only when he had touched them, or more precisely the handkerchief in which they were wrapped as in a winding sheet, only then did Franz remember that absurd mishap at a lower layer of a dream. When he had first come into this room, looked around and opened the window, only to reveal a dark backyard and a dark, noisy tree, he had first of all torn off his soiled collar that had been oppressing his neck and hurriedly began washing his face. Like an imbecile, he had placed his glasses on the edge of the washstand beside the basin. As he lifted the heavy thing in order to empty it into the pail, he not only knocked his glasses off the edge of the stand, but sidestepping an awkward rhythm with the slushing basin he held, he heard an ominous crunch under his heel. In the process of reconstructing this event in his mind, Franz grimaced and groaned. All the festive lights of Friedrichstrasse had been stamped out by his boot. He would have to take the glasses to be repaired. Only one lens was still in place that was cracked. He palpated rather than re-examined the cripple. Mentally, he had already gone out of doors in search of the proper shop. First that, and then the important, rather frightening visit, and remembering how his mother had insisted he make the call on the very first morning after his arrival, it will be just the day when you can find a businessman at home. Franz remembered that it was Sunday. He clucked his tongue and lay still. Complicated but familiar poverty that cannot afford spare sets of expensive articles now resulted in primitive panic. Without his glasses he was as good as blind, and yet he must set out on a perilous journey across a strange city. He imagined the predatory specters that last night had been crowding near the station, their motors running, their doors slamming when they were safely speckled. But with his vision dimmed by the rainy night, he had started to cross the dark square, that he had gone to bed after the mishap without taking the walk that he had been looking forward to, without getting his first taste of Berlin at the very hour of its voluptuous glitter and swarming. Instead, in miserable self-compensation, he had succumbed again that first night to the solitary practice he had sworn to give up before his departure, but to pass the entire day in that hostile hotel room amid vague hostile objects, to wait with nothing to do until Monday, when a shop with a sign for the seeing, in the shape of a giant blue pince-nez, would open. Such a prospect was unthinkable. Franz threw back the quilt and barefoot padded wearily to the window. A light blue, delicate, marvelously sunny morning welcomed him. Most of the yard was taken up by the sable velvet of what seemed to be a spreading tree shadow, above which he was just able to distinguish the blurry orange-red hue of what looked like rich foliage. Booming city, indeed. Out there all was as quiet as the remote serenity of a luminous rural autumn. Aha, it was the room that was noisy. Its hubbub comprised of the hollow hum of irksome human thoughts, the clatter of a moved chair under which a much-needed sock had long been hiding from the purblind, the plash of water, the tinkle of small coins that had foolishly fallen out of an elusive waistcoat, the scrape of a suitcase as it was dragged to a far corner where there would be no danger of one's tripping over it again. There was an additional background noise, the room's own groan and din, like the voice of a magnified seashell, in contrast with that sunny, startling, miraculous stillness, preserved like a costly wine in the cool depths of the yard. At last Franz overcame all the blotches and blinks of fog, located his hat, recoiled from the embrace of the clowning mirror, and made for the door. Only his face remained bare. Having negotiated the stairs where an angel was singing as she polished the banisters, he showed the desk clerk the address on the priceless card and was told what bus to take and where to wait for it. He hesitated for a moment, tempted by the magic and majestic possibility of a taxi. He rejected it not only because of the cost, but because of his potential employer might make him for a spendthrift if he arrived in state. Once if the street was engulfed in streaming radiance, outlines did not exist, colors had no substance. Like a woman's wispy dress that had slipped off its hanger, the city shimmered and fell in fantastic folds not held up by anything, a discarnate iridescence limply suspended in the azure autumnal air. Beyond the nacrine desert of the square, across which a car sped now and then with a new metropolitan trumpeting, great pink edifices loomed, and suddenly a sunbeam, a gleam of glass, would stab him painfully in the pupil. Franz reached a plausible street corner. After much fussing and squinting, he discovered the red blur of the bus stop, which rippled and wavered like the supports of a bathhouse when you drive under it. Almost directly the yellow mirage of a bus came into being, stepping on somebody's foot, which at once dissolved under him as everything else was dissolving. Franz seized a handrail, and a voice, evidently the conductor's, barked at his ears, "Up!" It was the first time he had ascended this kind of spiral staircase. Only a few old trams served his hometown, and when the bus jerked into motion he caught a frightening glimpse of the asphalt, rising like a silvery wall, grabbed someone's shoulder and carried along by the force to an inexorable curve, during which the whole bus seemed to heel over, zoomed up the last steps, and found himself on top. He sat down and looked around with helpless indignation. He was floating very high above the city. On the street below, people slithered like jellyfish whenever the traffic froze. Then the bus started again, and the houses, shade blue on one side of the street, sun hazy on the other, rode by like clouds blending imperceptibly with the tender sky. Thus is how Franz first saw the city. Phantasmally tinted, ethereal, impregnated with swimming colors, in no way resembling his crude, provincial dream. Was he on the right bus? Yes, said the ticket dispenser. Okay, about to run out of battery, so I have to stop it here.